Welcome to No Rares Required, Episode 14, Azorius Artifacts. Every week I discuss a drafting strategy for a different archetype, and today we will be covering my strategy for drafting Azorius, or white-blue, in Phyrexia All Will Be One. Now that we are a month into the set, people have definitely caught on that white is a strong color, and it might be my favorite color of the set. It has the Boros 4 Mirrodin strategy that I covered on week 2. It has the Azorius artifact strategy that I'll cover today. And it has the toxic strategies of Celestia and Orsov. Gruul has proven itself to be the strongest archetype, so much that people are tired of seeing it from a content perspective. But it is definitely feeling overcrowded, especially during in-pod drafting. Its options for pivots are also somewhat limited outside of being mostly red and pivoting into an oil-based strategy in Izzet. White, on the other hand, can pivot quite easily, but you need to take advantage of this quickly because the white cards are also starting to disappear. Azorius is the 5th most drafted archetype, so really middle of the pack, and it has somewhat of a below-average win rate on 17 lands. Similar to Dimir, it aims to utilize some underappreciated blue cards that really only work in this archetype specifically. The archetype's theme is artifacts, and you want a lot. I think a minimum of 10, but I've easily hit 15 or more. My one and only Tier 1 common is Basilica Shepherd. This card is at least Tier 2 in every white deck, but performs the best in Azorius because of artifact synergy. While it itself is not an artifact, it spawns 2 1/1 artifact mites, so it's kind of 2 artifacts in one card. Again, with the double pip in white, it really wants 10 sources of white. So it's really best in the Azorius deck that is mostly white. But it's so good, a copy usually makes it in even if I'm running 8 planes. As I mentioned in my Boros guide, a 5/5 for 5 is pretty decent in limited, especially when those stats are spread over 3 creatures, one of which has flying. Just makes this a ton of value. Also, similar to Dimir, this archetype has a fair number of commons and can easily support multiple drafters in a single pod. And it's not uncommon to find yourself as the only Azorius drafter, at least for the time being. My first Tier 2 top common for Azorius is Mandible Justiciar. It's amazing in decks with a high count of artifacts. Boros also comes to mind, but because of the 4 Mirrodin equipment, I tend to end up with the 10+ artifacts most reliably in Azorius, where this can reliably act as a 3/2 lifelinker for 2. Cards like Basilica Shepherd trigger this twice as well. The downside is they tend to be taken pretty early, so I try to grab as many of these as I can. Planar Disruption is my second Tier 2 common. I mentioned this in my Boros guide as well. 2-cost removal is amazing in limited, especially for tempo and aggro strategies, and Azorius is no exception. It's great in every white archetype. Being able to neutralize your opponent's biggest threat, including planeswalkers, makes this card great. They also get picked up early, so you'll want to take this when you see it, so you can get as many as you can get. My third Tier 2 common is Chrome Prowler. A lot of people talked about how Eye of Malcator, which we'll get to later, was the secret sauce to Azorius, but in my opinion, this is the card that wins you the most games. It's a 3/2 flash artifact creature that taps an opponent's creature when it enters the battlefield. You can use this to flash in and block a small toxic creature unexpectedly, but I've used it most often to tap my opponent's big creature or flyer before the attack phase. Cards like this are really important because they help you win if you're on the draw by taking tempo away from your opponent, which is why I think it's the superstar of Azorius. This card also goes late, and if I see them on the wheel, I use it as a sign that it's time for some Azorius. Now for my Tier 3 commons. Indoctrination Attendant works well against the enchantment-based removal in the set, both Mesmerizing Dose as well as Planar Disruption. I still like it in the Boros archetype the most because of being able to get additional value out of your 4 Mirrodin equipment, but it often plays as a 4/5 for 4, and the 1/1 might trigger triggers your artifacts entering the battlefield effects, and is worth a mention in every white archetype. My next Tier 3 common for Azorius is Crawling Chorus. or as I and many others like to call it, Triangle Man. Its best archetype is Orzhov, since that's really the white archetype that is most interested in winning through poison counters. I still think it's a great card in every white archetype except Boros, but even there it's still decent filler. It's important to have early plays in the set, and it's important to have something that develops the board. The 1/1 Might that this card spawns when it dies can trigger your artifact entering the battlefield effects, and hitting Corrupted can be nice for cards like Incisor Glider, which is an artifact, and you might be including it as filler in your deck. My third Tier 3 common is Malcator's Watcher. It's a 1/1 Flying Vigilance artifact for 2 that draws a card when it dies. I mentioned it in my guide to Dimir, and after a week of drafting, I think I'm going to have to move Watcher down to good filler for Dimir. You really need turn 1 and turn 2 toxic creatures for that archetype to work. Azorius, on the other hand, has many delicious things to do with this card, as we'll get into when we get to the uncommons. My fourth Tier 3 common for Azorius is Eye of Malcator. This card is only good in Azorius, but it has some problems, and I've heard some differing opinions about how many you should be running. I missed what Sirkovitz had to say about the 17 lands data, so if anyone wants to fill me in, that would be greatly appreciated. I find myself agreeing with Alex from Court of Calls from Lords of Limited that probably around 2 feels about right. The problem with this card versus Chrome Prowler, for example, is that it increases the discrepancy between whether you are on the play or the draw. Since outside of Chrome Prowler, you have very few ways of activating this card as a blocker, and so it is very offensively sided. It is a card that wheels, though, since it's only good in the Azorius archetype, where you plan to play an artifact every turn. So I do think it makes a decent signaling card, along with Chrome Prowler, since if this card doesn't wheel, then you know someone else is trying to be in an Azorius. My last Tier 3 common for Azorius is Surgical Skull Bomb. I've heard it suggested that the deck can use any cantripping 1-cost artifact, since Maze Skull Bomb, the green Skull Bomb, has a relatively high win rate in this archetype. I think it is more of a statistical outlier, since other Skull Bombs don't have a similarly high win rate. Either way, Surgical Skull Bomb is definitely better than filler. Being able to bounce your opponent's play and draw a card plays very much like Tolarian Geyser from DMU. Having 1- and 2-cost artifacts is important, so you want to include 1 or 2 of these when you can. They tend to go late, so I try to pick them up on the wheel. We also have a fair amount of good uncommons to cover as well. To start, Azorius has 2 mythic level uncommons. The first is Annex Sentry. I mentioned it as a mythic level uncommon in Boros. It's a mythic level uncommon in every white archetype. A 1/4 for 3 is a decent stat block for blocking your opponent's early pressure. It has Toxic, which isn't super important for this archetype, but hitting Corrupted can trigger your Incisor Gliders, which you might be running as filler since they are artifacts. And most importantly, you get to remove an artifact or creature with mana value 3 or less until Annex Sentry leaves the battlefield. This is another card that can help minimize the play versus the draw discrepancy and really take the wind out of your opponent's sails. It's a perfectly justifiable card to take pack 1, pick 1. It's just that good. The next mythic level uncommon for Azorius is Unctus's Retrofitter. It's tier 1, 2, or 3 in every other blue archetype, but in Azorius, it is tier S. You have so many artifacts to hit with this card. Remember Malcator's Watcher, the 1/1 flying artifact? How does a 4/4 flying vigilance that draws a card when it dies on turn 3 sound? Amazing. Remember Mandible Justiciar, the 2/1 lifelink artifact creature? How about a 4/4 lifelink that gets +1/+1 every time an artifact enters the battlefield? There are so many options to make this card really shine. If I open this up for my pack 1 pick 1, I always think it's time to force some Azorius. Now for the tier 1 uncommons. Swooping Lookout is a 1/2 flying vigilance artifact flyer and another perfect target for Unctus's Retrofitter. It goes pretty late for an uncommon, around pick 5 or so, and is decent tier 2 in Boros as well. It's an early blocker, and it's important to have 1 and 2 drops in this set. Bladed Ambassador is my second tier 1 uncommon. Azorius is aiming to win the game quickly, so having access to a 3/1 for 2 is great, and the oil counter is usually usually means that your opponent has to use 2 cards to remove this guy. Although it's not an artifact, it's a 2-drop, and that's very important. Some people have mentioned that many of the archetypes tend to have a U-shaped curve. Gruul, for example, has very few good 3-drops, so you tend to have a gap. I found this archetype tends to have a fair number of cards on 3, and can actually struggle to find 1s and 2s, so I take Bladed Ambassador highly in this archetype. Cephalopod Sentry is my last Tier 1 uncommon for Azorius. It's a star 5 artifact flyer for 4. This card really only needs to come in as a 3/5 flyer to be pretty decent. After that, it just starts getting insane. And if you're playing 15 plus artifacts and can manage to play an artifact every turn, a 4/5 flyer for 4 that just keeps getting bigger? Yes, please. Thank you very much. They also go reasonably late for an uncommon, around pick 5. Now for my Tier 2 uncommons. Hexgold Hoverwings are mythic level uncommon in Boros. In my guide to Boros, I mentioned that they were good filler in other white archetypes. I stand corrected. I've enjoyed playing them in both Azorius and Celestia, and they are much better than filler. Hoverwings come in as a 3/2 flyer. They give all of your equipped creatures +1/+0, which for Azorius is just other Hoverwings, but it counts as an artifact, and you can move it around for 3 to give your creatures flying. I had originally thought the equip cost was going to be a bit too much, but being able to send a flyer in over and over is very nice. My next Tier 2 uncommon for Azorius is Ossification. This is the best removal that white has, and it has been performing very well in every white archetype. I've moved it up to Tier S in Boros. That's 5 mythic level uncommons for those keeping count for Boros. In Azorius, I've found myself needing the removal a little less than in other aggro strategies, but I'll still take as many as I can get. My last Tier 2 uncommon is Atrax's Skitterfang. I still stand by my claim that it's best in Simic, where you're aiming to win through a mid-range proliferate strategy and can easily proliferate to give this card more oil counters. It's great in most decks, and in Azorius I think the lifelink and flying tend to be the abilities I choose the most, since it tends to be a race. My first Tier 3 uncommon is Tamiyo's Immobilizer. It's best in Izzet, where you aim to proliferate the oil counters, but it's an artifact and better than filler in Azorius. The best part of this card is using this to tap a creature on your opponent's turn, then again on your turn so you can take out 2 blockers with this card. My last Tier 3 uncommon is Serum Snare. The proliferate doesn't matter too much, but this can help remove a problematic blocker or to help swing the tempo in your favor. The only other archetype that's looking to pick these up is Dimir, so they tend to go late around pick 5 or so. Now for the rares. I mentioned White Sun's Twilight in my Boros guide, where it performs the worst of any of the white archetypes. In Azorius, it performs the best. Definitely Tier S. Usually you have to cast this for 7, but because of the synergies around Artifact Enter the Battlefield effects in Azorius, I think Azorius is the only archetype that can get away for casting this for cheaper than 7. If I open this up, pack 1, pick 1, I definitely think it's time for some Azorius. Because there is so much to cover, I'm going to skip some rares, but give them a brief mention as to which guide will cover them in greater detail. Eternal Wanderer is best in Orsov, but has great synergies with cards like Basilica Shepherd, or anything with an Enter the Battlefield effect. And Blue Sun's Twilight is best in Simic, where you aim to ramp to turn 7. Unctus Grand Metatech, though, is worth talking about in more detail. It's great in every blue archetype, but it's a lord for artifact creatures, so clearly it's going to be best in Azorius. I put it at Tier 1. On a side note, do be careful about the Phyrexian mana ability, as it can only be activated as a sorcery, and I've seen several people mess this up. My Tier 2 rare for Azorius is Malcator, Purity Overseer. It's a 4/4 worth of stats for 3, and usually not more. But it's a great card to return to your hand with Indoctrination Attendant, or Blink with Eternal Wanderer, or return to your hand with Serum Snare. I've also been able to trigger this a second time without any tricks by playing a Skull Bomb after a Basilica Shepherd, but that was, I think, more of a fluke than anything else. I'm going to skip Skrelv Defector Might, which is best in Orsov or Selesnya, where the toxic counters really matter. A rare worth mentioning that might come as a bit of a surprise, though, is Kaido Dancing Shadow. This card is best in Dimir, where you don't have to splash it, but it is a great card to splash. I think if you open this up and you find yourself in a black or blue archetype, you should try to splash it, except for maybe in Rakdos. It's not the best tempo card, but bouncing a Basilica Shepherd back to your hand to trigger the second loyalty ability is definitely worth a mention. I'm also going to skip Kimba Ka Enduring, which is best in Boros, as well as Mirix, which is best in Selesnya or Orsov because of toxic counters and mites. I'm also going to skip Argentum Masticore, which I find to be best in Simic or Gruul, where you can ramp to it. I really like it in Simic because then you can use cards to draw to feed your hand so that you can continue to not sacrifice your Masticore. And I'm also going to skip the Seed Core, which is best in Orsov or Selesnya. I'll cover them in greater detail in the future. They're all good to include if you find yourself being able to pick them up, but I wouldn't go out of my way. My last Tier 3 rare worth a mention is Blade of Shared Souls. It's an artifact, and being able to copy your Cephalopod Sentries is a fun time. Now for the mythics. My Tier S superstar for Azorius is Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines, aka Mom. She's great in every white archetype, but has the highest win rate in Azorius. She makes so many things in Azorius better. She makes Basilica Shepherd enter with 4 1/1 mites. She makes Malcator enter with 2 3/3s. She lets Unctus's Retrofitter make 2 4/4s out of your artifacts. Your Chrome Prowlers tap for 2 creatures. The list goes on. And in the mirror match or against Boros, this card just wins you the game. For Mirrodin equipment, when this is in, is just an equipment that comes into the play and no creature gets spawned, and then you have an equipment with a terrible equipment cost. It's absolutely miserable if you haven't experienced it yet. Anyway, not to mention, she's also got really good stats. She's a 4/7 Vigilance for 5, so she'd be worth playing for the stats alone. Next up at Tier 1, we have Jace, the Perfected Mind. Nothing special about Jace and Azorius, but I have yet to mention him, so I'll do it now. I think he might be slightly better in Simic, where you have Proliferate and might be interested in doing a mill strategy, but time will tell. For now, he's Tier 1 in every blue archetype. I also feel like the real magic is getting him up to 7 loyalty before choosing to mill them for over half their deck. Being able to ramp to this on turn 3 in Simic seems pretty tempting. Anyway, in Azorius, if you end up getting stalled out of your tempo strategy, this is a great alternative win con. And last but not, I'm going to skip Sword of Forge and Frontier, as well as Mondrak Glory Dominus, which I've already covered. Both I think are best in Boros. Last but not least, I was tempted to skip this card as well, but I feel obligated to mention it here because of the time of recording this guide, Phyrexian Vindicator has the highest win rate in Azorius. With 4 double pip white, you really need to be in a mono white deck, at least if you plan on playing this on turn 4. What I take this to mean more than anything is that your Azorius deck should be mostly white, with blue as your secondary color. If you find yourself being mostly white, splashing blue, then go for Vindicator. Thank you for enjoying my simple guide to Azorius. I posted a full draft with Azorius earlier this month, and it had 3 eyes of Malcator, as well as Malcator himself, if you want to see how I use this guide to grab trophies. I'll include the link in the top right. Thank you for taking the time to hit like and subscribe. It helps me out, and I appreciate it. If there's any archetype that you want to see next, let me know in the comments below. Once again, thank you all for the support, and I'll see you next week.